This all began one evening when I was hanging out at my childhood best friend's apartment for what was supposed to be a fun movie night. We hadn't spent time together in a while, so we were catching up. Her place was small but cozy, a little cluttered, and filled with feminine decorations. We were in our comfy sweatpants, ready to watch classic princess movies. Her apartment wasn't the most organized. Things were scattered about, but it had a certain charm that always made me feel at home. We decided to order pizza for dinner. She casually mentioned that someone I had never met before, named Jason, would be the one delivering it. At first, I wasn't thrilled to hear this. I assumed it meant she had invited some guy over, which wasn't what I had planned for the night. But it turned out Jason was just the delivery guy. He wasn't staying. When Jason arrived, there was an odd awkwardness about him. He seemed nervous, fumbling with the pizza boxes and avoiding direct eye contact. My friend introduced us briefly, and from the way she spoke to him, overly polite and appreciative, it was clear he did more for her than just deliver food. After handing over the pizza, there was a brief, forced conversation. My friend was extra nice to him despite his awkwardness. He wasn't great at chatting and seemed out of place. Then Jason asked for my number. I felt cornered because my friend was sitting right there, so I just gave it to him. We talked for maybe 5 minutes before my friend subtly hinted that he should leave, saying something like, "Thanks so much for bringing this." He got the message. We both hugged him goodbye, and she added a casual, "Drive safe." Another cue that he should go. After he left, I asked her what that was all about. She explained that Jason was kind of like her unpaid assistant. He ran errands for her, did her grocery shopping, and even delivered her takeout. I got the feeling Jason was just a lonely guy who desperately wanted company, especially female attention. My friend and I were both young and naive at the time, around 22, but we could tell something wasn't quite right with him. It was hard to pinpoint exactly what it was, though. Jason started a group chat with my friend and me. Every week, he'd send a meme or two, like he was trying to stay in our lives without overstepping. Maybe he was used to being ignored or blocked by other women in the past. It felt like he wanted to make sure I wouldn't forget about him, but was also careful not to give me a reason to cut him off. I can't say for sure, but that's how it seemed. Then he started offering to help me with things. The first time I just said, "Thanks, but I'm good," but he kept asking every weekend. Eventually, I made the mistake of accepting his help. I should have known better. I had found a great deal on a washing machine through an online marketplace, but I had no way to pick it up or install it. When I casually mentioned it in the chat, Jason eagerly offered to handle everything. He picked it up, brought it to my place, and installed it like a pro, saving me a ton of trouble. I tried to pay him for his time and effort, but he refused. When I kept insisting, he suggested that I could just repay him by going on a hike with him. That made me uneasy. It felt too personal, almost like it could be mistaken for a date. But Jason framed it as just a friendly outing, a way to balance out the favor. I rationalized it as fair compensation for the help with the washing machine. Plus, I figured he didn't have many friends, so maybe he just wanted some company. But I couldn't shake a weird feeling about being alone with him in such an isolated setting. On the day of the hike, Jason picked a trail nearby. I had been there before. It was beautiful. As we walked, he talked about normal things, his job, hobbies, the weather. Everything seemed fine until he suggested we step off the main path to see something special he wanted to show me. I had no idea what he meant, but when we reached a secluded area, there it was, a dead body. My heart started pounding. Jason stood there, eerily calm, as if this was completely normal. His nonchalant attitude made my stomach turn. It didn't seem like he had just stumbled upon it. He wasn't reacting like a regular person would. The smell was awful, but not as overpowering as I expected. I wasn't an expert, but I guess the body had been there a while, though not too long. I muttered some excuse about needing to get back and started walking quickly toward the main path. I urged Jason to follow. My mind was racing. Was this some kind of twisted intimidation tactic? Was he trying to prove he wasn't just some awkward, harmless guy? Or did he think this would make him unforgettable? I didn't know, but I felt like I had to get out of there. As we walked back, I was in full fight or flight mode, scanning for other hikers or park rangers, anyone who could make me feel less alone. When I spotted another person on the trail, I immediately called out, not to expose Jason, but just to ask for directions back to the parking lot. I wanted to make sure we weren't alone anymore. I then asked the stranger to walk us back, pretending I was confused about the directions. Eventually, he agreed. Having that other person with us helped me feel safer, like I was reconnecting to normal life after the shock of what Jason had just shown me. When we reached the parking lot, I called my friend and told her I was with Jason. I suggested he could drop me off at her place, saying we'd be there in 20 minutes. That was my way of making sure someone knew my whereabouts in case anything happened. I also texted my friend what had happened, just to have it documented. When we arrived at her apartment, we thanked Jason and politely told him to leave. Then, I told my friend everything, the insects, the decomposing face, all of it. She was horrified, not just at the body, but at how disturbingly casual Jason had been about it. She admitted she had always felt something was off about him, though she never imagined anything this extreme. We agreed we needed to cut him out of our lives, but she felt stuck because she had relied on him for so many things. We made a plan, a slow phase out. We would only interact with him in group settings. We would respond to his messages less and less. I would never ask for his help again, and my friend would gradually stop as well. Jason kept texting, offering to run errands or asking if we needed anything. My friend would reply with things like, "I'm trying to be more independent, but you've been such a huge help." Eventually, she started dating someone new. When she introduced Jason to her boyfriend, Jason never contacted her again. I had reported what I saw to the police that same night. Took a while before we got an update. About a month later, the news confirmed a body had been found in that exact location where Jason had taken me. They made an arrest, but not Jason. It was some other man Jason happened to follow on social media. I have no idea if Jason was involved in any way, but I never spoke to him again. This took place about 6 years ago. I was around 13, and my brother was 27 at the time. He had been serving in the military for several years and was about to deploy to the Middle East for his second tour, if I remember correctly. Another thing worth mentioning is that he had recently completed the military special forces training about 3 or 4 months before this trip. By then, he was an active duty special forces engineer, definitely not someone you'd want to mess with. Since we both grew up loving the outdoors, he thought it would be a great idea to take me on a backpacking trip before he left for nearly a year. We decided to go to a remote wilderness area in northern Georgia for a few days. Everything was going smoothly until our third night out there. Around 8 p.m., we had our campsite set up, eating dinner, and chatting by the fire about typical guy stuff: guns, sports, and girls. For context, our camp was set up about 50 yards from a big creek and another 50 yards downhill from a well-used trail, forming a rough triangle with the water and the path. Since it was summer, it wasn't fully dark yet when 2 men in their late 20s wandered up to us, asking if we had seen any wild boars while hiking. Since this was rural Georgia, we actually had spotted some deeper in the wilderness and told them so. Though they seemed polite, my brother casually referred to them as good old boys. I, on the other hand, got a bad feeling. Their clothes were dirty, their hair greasy, and they had scruffy facial hair. They looked like something straight out of an old backwoods thriller. They hung around longer than necessary, asking questions about how long we'd been out there, how much longer we planned to stay, and other things that made it seem like they were sizing us up. Then, out of nowhere, they just said goodbye and walked off. I didn't feel directly threatened, and I know my brother definitely wasn't intimidated, but I still felt unsettled by the whole thing. Fast forward 3 or 4 hours later. We had gone to sleep in our tent when I suddenly woke up to the sound of multiple dogs barking. I've always been a deep sleeper, but they sounded really close, maybe 100 yards away. My heart started racing, and I nudged my brother through my sleeping bag, asking if he was awake and if he heard the dogs. He answered immediately, "Yeah, I've been listening to them get closer for the past hour. Just stay quiet and don't move." 12-year-old me was practically ready to panic. We could also hear occasional shouts from different voices, but none of them seemed to be coming closer. A few minutes later, my brother whispered, They're just hunting hogs. They use dogs to pin them down before shooting them. That explanation gave me a little relief, but not much. Somehow, I managed to drift back to sleep, though my brother later told me that the fact they were hunting at night was a major red flag. A few hours passed, and around 2 a.m., I woke up again to my brother shaking my shoulder and whispering, "Wake up, put your shoes on now. Be as quiet as possible and follow me." My heart started pounding again because I could still hear the dogs and voices. Fainter than before, but still there. Without asking any questions, I did exactly what he told me. As soon as we stepped out of the tent, he told me to get on his back. Carrying me was easy for him after all the weight he had to haul in the military. We quietly moved about 50 yards into the woods, heading toward where the creek and trail met, then crawled into some thick bushes. Since we were up on a hill, we had a good elevated view of our campsite. I remember how loudly I was breathing compared to how silent my brother was. Then, I heard the unmistakable sound of a pistol being loaded. I glanced over and saw that my brother had his handgun, a model he later gave to me years after this happened. He was watching the campsite intently. I started to whisper to him when he suddenly put his hand over my mouth and pointed toward the camp. The hunters had reached our site. There were 5 of them, along with 3 or 4 dogs. They all looked fairly young, but 2 of them were carrying rifles or shotguns, and the dogs were going wild, clearly picking up our scent. For anyone familiar with camping, nobody stumbles onto a random campsite in the middle of the woods with dogs and guns and has good intentions. My brother and I both knew this. I was absolutely terrified. I couldn't make out their words, but my brother later told me they were talking about us, though he hadn't caught any specifics. They lingered for about 20 minutes, shining flashlights around and chatting among themselves. Then, my brother leaned in and whispered, "If they come this way, I want you to turn and run as fast as you can. Don't stop, don't look back, stay off the trail, and head for the flashing lights." I had no idea what he meant by flashing lights, but I didn't ask. I knew I could find my way back because he had taught me how to navigate. Then, he handed me a small flashlight and told me, "Whatever you do, don't take off the red filter." Later, he explained that the red filter helps preserve night vision and reduces how visible the light is from a distance. At that moment, I was so scared I felt like crying, but at the same time, I had a weird sense of confidence, like he trusted me to handle myself. We stayed hidden for a while longer when, suddenly, the men started shouting, "Where are y'all?" before randomly firing shots into the woods. My brother instantly pulled me down behind the hill and shielded me with his body. Thankfully, because of our elevated position, we were protected from any direct fire. They shot maybe 5 or 6 more times before heading back the way they came. Then, about 100 yards away, we saw flashing emergency lights and heard sirens blaring through the trees. Turns out, while I had been asleep earlier, my brother had used our family's emergency satellite phone to call the park rangers. Since this wilderness area spanned tens of thousands of acres, it had taken them a while to reach us on the rugged back roads. As soon as we saw the rangers' truck, my brother signaled with his flashlight, directing them toward where the hunters had gone. The ranger immediately sped off, scanning the woods with his spotlight. Once the hunters were completely out of sight, we packed up our gear and waited by the trail. A little while later, the ranger returned and gave us a ride in his truck bed back to the main station. On the way, my brother told me how proud he was of how I had handled the situation and said we could talk about it with our parents if I wanted to. I asked him not to, worried that they might never let me go camping again. To this day, I still don't know what those men wanted, and I don't think I want to find out. Three years ago in Phoenix, my girlfriend and I, after planning for 5 years, turned 29, sold nearly everything we owned, including my car, packed up her SUV, and decided to explore the US and parts of Canada. I guess you could call us nomads, as we tend to chase mild weather, find national parks, and go deep into the wilderness for days at a time. My sister likes to joke that we're modern hippies rebelling against the system. We don't live completely off the grid, but between the two of us, we have a single prepaid phone for emergencies and checking in with loved ones, along with one laptop that I use for work. I freelance as a writer and content creator, primarily writing technical reports and online content for a robotics firm. The whole point of our lifestyle is to remain debt-free and keep our expenses minimal. I rely on free Wi-Fi, so about twice a week we make a trip to a town with a coffee shop to get online. This background is important so you understand how simply we live. Neither of us is into social media, and we're pretty clueless about various platforms like Instagram or how different apps work. Last summer, we decided to do some deep woods hiking in Missouri. It's not a state you often hear about for hiking destinations, but we'd read about its breathtaking scenery, and it definitely delivered. The regulations in this particular park were pretty relaxed. We didn't need a permit, and aside from a few basic rules, there was no check-in required. We had all the necessary supplies and planned a 6-day trek, 3 days in, 3 days out. The entire time, we didn't see or hear another soul. One evening, as we were scouting for a campsite just before dusk, about half a mile off the main trail, which is our usual standard, we followed what appeared to be an animal path. Almost by accident, we stumbled upon a green 2-person tent, nearly hidden among the foliage. Some backpackers prefer solitude, while others are more social. We leaned toward the latter, often enjoying conversations, shared meals, and forming temporary friendships with fellow travelers. The tent's entrance was zipped shut, so my girlfriend called out a greeting to announce our presence. No movement, no response. We figured the camper either wasn't around or preferred not to be disturbed, so we changed course to set up camp elsewhere. We spent the night peacefully and didn't give the tent another thought, until day 5, when we were making our way back toward the main trail and spotted the green tent again. This wasn't too unusual, as some hikers take their time in one spot. But generally, backcountry campers keep moving, so we hadn't expected to see it still there. This time, the tent flap was slightly open. My girlfriend greeted whoever might be inside. Again, nothing. She suggested we take a closer look in case someone was injured. I was uneasy about it from the start. Though we'd never had a bad experience ourselves, we'd heard stories from other hikers about territorial hermits and reclusive mountain folk who preferred isolation and sometimes carried weapons. But my girlfriend assured me we'd be fine, saying worst case we could offer a peace gesture, then move on. As we got within 20 yards, the overwhelming stench of decay hit us. My girlfriend had been calling out over the last few steps, but when the smell reached her, she turned to me and muttered, "If there's a body in there." A chill ran through me. I had never seen a corpse before, and I didn't want to start now. The closer we got, the stronger the odor became. I was sure we were about to stumble upon a decomposing human, but what we found was somehow worse. Just outside the tent lay the severed legs of a deer, all 4, buzzing with flies. It looked as if they had been partially cut and then violently torn off. It was a gruesome sight. Inside the tent, the remaining parts of the deer were even more disturbing. The head and torso were still intact, but the middle section was wrapped in a blue fleece blanket, soaked in blood where the limbs had been. The animal was positioned on its side, facing the tent opening. The tail had been removed, and the lower openings were stained with dried blood, stretched wide as if something had been forced into them. Its jaw was similarly distorted at a grotesque angle. The tent was open enough that we could see everything without stepping inside. Not that we could have anyway, the stench was unbearable. Nearby, there was a nearly empty bottle of baby oil and a filthy, stained kitchen towel. That was it. I started crying and begged my girlfriend to leave. All she could say was, "What the hell?" before we turned and ran. We bolted back toward the trail, putting as much distance between us and that horror as we could before nightfall forced us to set up camp. That night, we barely spoke. We sat in silence, whispering only to replay what we had just seen, over and over. Every little noise in the woods made us jump. My mind kept racing, imagining this deranged person returning, noticing our tracks, and hunting us down. I had never felt terror like that before. Just before dawn, we packed up and hiked out without stopping. On our way out of the park, we stopped at the ranger station to report what we had seen. The ranger, a young guy about our age, looked as shaken by our story as we had been living it. He took notes while my girlfriend pointed out the approximate location on a map. He asked if we had any idea how the deer had been killed. Until that moment, we hadn't even considered it. We had just assumed it had been shot. But with the way the body had been wrapped, we hadn't seen an entry wound. And we certainly weren't about to conduct an autopsy. Since then, we've shortened our backcountry trips to no more than 4 days. We're also much warier about calling out to other campsites, and we have never approached an unattended tent again. Up in the Sierra Verde National Reserve, our family had a cabin that had been passed down for generations. My younger sister and I spent every summer there. For folks from the dry plains of West Texas, it was paradise. Lush greenery, crisp mountain air. It was always a relief to escape the dusty ranch. Our dad was a former soldier, and with 2 daughters, he made sure we knew how to handle ourselves. He taught us survival skills, self-defense, and how to hunt and fish. We camped, hiked, and explored every inch of those woods. To us, it was all just part of growing up, but I suppose he saw it as preparing us for anything. Each summer, we spent weeks up there, trekking through old ghost towns, abandoned mining sites, and checking out the historic canal system built to redirect the Blue River back in the late 19th century. At least, I think that's the right time frame. Regardless, it was a fantastic place to hike, with crystal clear mountain lakes, winding creeks, and all kinds of wildlife. This happened when I was in college, and my younger sister was finishing up high school. Dad was working back home, so he'd only come up to visit every few weekends. Meanwhile, we stayed with our mom, though she mostly stuck to painting near the cabin or running errands in town. My sister and I spent most of our time on the back roads, hiking trails, and sleeping under the stars. It was late June, maybe early July, when we decided to make the trip up to Whispering Lake. It's one of my favorite spots up there because, from the right angle, the water forms the shape of a heart. We packed our gear in the morning. Small backpacks, water, snacks, and hammocks to relax by the lake. I've always loved the outdoors, and I swear, when it's quiet enough, you can hear the trees whispering. Our dad had drilled it into us that we should always carry a knife when hiking, just in case. We were confident and prepared. Since our family's cabin sat high in the valley, we set out on foot toward the trailhead. The route first led to Pine Hollow Lake, where we then veered onto the path for Whispering Lake. Along the way, we passed a few hikers headed for Pine Hollow, but no one else was going our way. That was fine by us. It meant we'd have the lake all to ourselves. The final stretch had some tough switchbacks, but the view at the top made it all worth it. The water shimmered an incredible shade of emerald green, untouched and perfect. Once we arrived, we wandered around the shoreline before stepping into the woods to find a good spot for our hammocks. That's when my sister stopped and whispered, "Do you smell that?" Yeah, I did. The sharp, coppery scent of blood and decay. We'd hunted enough to recognize the stench immediately. Then we saw it, a deer carcass. But it wasn't just the kill that disturbed us, it was the way it was arranged. The animal's organs had been removed and placed around it in a pattern, with small stacks of stones in between. It wasn't like someone had butchered it for meat. It was deliberate, ritualistic. I'd seen plenty of gruesome hunting scenes before, but this was different. It made my stomach turn. I took a step back, unsettled, when my sister grabbed my arm. I turned just in time to see him. A man stood about 20 feet away, partially hidden among a cluster of trees. He looked as if he had just crawled out of the deer itself. His body smeared with blood, his clothes tattered, or maybe he wasn't wearing much at all. I didn't look long enough to figure it out. His wide eyes were locked on us, wild and unfocused, like he wasn't entirely present. My dad had always told us that if we ever found ourselves in a situation where we felt cornered, we should take control, do something unexpected, anything to shift the balance of power. That was racing through my mind as I saw my sister about to bolt. I stepped forward instead. "Nice kill," I called out. "You use a bow?" He didn't answer, just stood there, staring, unblinking. His expression was unreadable, but I could tell he wasn't all there. Maybe he'd lost his grip on reality. Maybe he was on something. Either way, I didn't like it. I casually rested my hand on the knife at my waist, making sure he saw it. I wasn't looking for a fight, but I wanted him to know I wasn't defenseless. Still nothing. Just silence. He wasn't blinking. He wasn't moving. It was almost like he thought if he stayed still enough, we wouldn't see him. My sister whispered my name, barely audible. I knew she was ready to run. I slowly backed away, keeping my eyes locked on his. Good hunting today? I tried again. Nothing. That was enough for me. We turned and walked, fast, back toward the lake, moving around the shoreline to put distance between us and him. My sister was trembling. At first, I was just angry. If he wanted to get weird with his deer, fine, but why right here? Why like this? We made it back to the trailhead, stopping just long enough to catch our breath. I scanned the tree line while my sister stood in shock. We needed to move. I picked up the pace, hoping we'd run into more hikers before long. But the odds weren't great. This trail wasn't busy, and by now it was nearly noon. Then I felt it, that creeping sensation. We weren't alone. I kept glancing back, but at first, there was nothing. My sister refused to turn around. She just powered ahead. Then the first pebble hit me. Tiny rocks being thrown. Not by accident. It had to be him. My sister was practically running now, but I was fuming. I wasn't about to let some lunatic intimidate us off our own trails. Go back to your deer, I yelled. Leave us alone. My sister hissed at me to shut up and keep moving, but I was fed up. The pebbles stopped, and then came the growling. Low, guttural, almost canine. He's growling at us, my sister said, her voice shaking. Just keep going, I muttered. Ignore him. But he followed us, stalking just beyond the tree line, growling, barking. We never saw him again, but we knew he was there. We heard him. It wasn't until we neared the junction with Pine Hollow Trail that the sound stopped, as if he'd finally given up. We hiked the rest of the way in silence, still rattled. My sister was convinced he had bad intentions, that we had been in real danger. I wasn't sure. Maybe he was just some unhinged weirdo who got a thrill out of scaring people. Either way, we told our parents when we got home. My dad didn't like what he heard. After that, he made sure we learned even more self-defense. He also forbade us from hiking alone again. We avoided that trail for years after. It was too much for my sister. Even for me, it was hard to shake the memory. What I didn't know at the time was that, after we told our mom, she called some of the neighbors. The next day, a few men went up there to check it out. They found the deer carcass. They also found 2 empty hiking backpacks like the kind day hikers use. No supplies inside, just discarded. Further back in the woods, they came across a makeshift campsite. But whoever had been staying there was gone. I believe it was the summer before my junior year of high school. I had been attending overnight camps since I was a kid, and that summer was no different. However, this time I had signed up for a different type of camp, one where we would be trekking through the Blue Ridge Mountains for 2 weeks instead of staying at the campsite. It was a new experience for me, but I was thrilled because I've always loved adventure. On this trip, there were 2 female counselors, 9 other girls, and me. A few days in, we were still learning more about each other, but we had already started feeling pretty comfortable together. We stopped for lunch near a small waterfall along the trail. Our resting spot was close to a section of the path where a road cut through. As we ate, we all noticed a sketchy-looking van driving back and forth on that same stretch of road. No one said anything at first, but we all saw it. After several minutes of the van circling, it suddenly turned onto the trail and stopped near us. We assumed the driver was lost or looking for a restroom, so we didn't think much of it. Finally, a man jumped out of the vehicle, ran toward us and shouted, "Does anyone here know CPR? My stepbrother is having seizures." Our 2 counselors immediately got up and followed him to his van. They were gone for a few minutes, and during that time we started feeling uneasy. Some of the girls whispered, saying they were sure they had seen the van pass by multiple times earlier. Others pointed out that if it was truly an emergency, why would he take the time to clarify his stepbrother? When our counselors finally returned, they had blank, unreadable expressions. We started bombarding them with questions, but they didn't say much. Then, the man returned, carrying something strange. It was one of those plastic Halloween decorations that people put on their porches, but instead of a candy bowl, it was just an eerie puppet. He walked up to us and started talking in a weird voice, saying his puppet liked girls. He even claimed the puppet could speak and pressed a button on its foot to prove it. We all sat there silently, continuing our lunch while avoiding eye contact. Eventually, he must have realized no one was engaging because he walked back to his van, left the door open, and blasted loud music. He stayed there for what felt like an eternity before finally driving off. As soon as he left, we quickly packed our bags and got moving again. The whole thing wasn't outright terrifying, but it was unsettling, and it was just the beginning of a bizarre day. We continued our trek down the trail, talking about the strange encounter before switching to sharing scary stories. Eventually, we reached our campsite. Since we had arrived early, there was plenty of daylight left. Like most teenage girls, we got bored easily and started wandering around the campsite. At one point, we came across a group of boys and flirted with them for a bit until they lost interest and wandered off. Afterward, we decided to play a game called Predators and Prey. The details of the game weren't important, but it was better with a bigger group. Coincidentally, 3 guys strolled over and introduced themselves. They weren't the same boys we had been chatting with earlier. Since they seemed friendly, one of the girls invited them to join our game. That's when things started feeling off. During breaks, people would share personal stories and get to know each other better. Even us girls, who had already been talking nonstop for days. Out of nowhere, one of the guys blurted out that 2 of them were trans. I want to make it clear that I have absolutely no problem with people expressing their identities. I fully support people being themselves. But the way they randomly brought it up when we barely knew them felt unexpected. Then, they started talking about how they were trying to start a reality show about 3 trans men living in the city. The 3rd member of their group, who wasn't trans, would just pretend to be on the show. Again, it wasn't that the concept itself was strange, just that it seemed completely out of the blue given the situation. Later in the game, they were whispering among themselves and suddenly burst into laughter. One of them loudly said, "That's funny because your dad's in jail." The conversation had already been odd, but at that point, the energy shifted. Everyone felt uncomfortable. Trying to change the subject, one of the girls decided to tell them about the creepy puppet man we had encountered earlier that day. Instead of reacting with concern, they laughed and casually said, "Oh yeah, that's our uncle. He dropped us off here earlier." That made all of us uneasy. Not long after, they said they were heading back to their tent for the night. We were relieved. Later, when a few girls went to use the restroom, they had to pass by the guy's tent. On the way there, they overheard them singing Justin Timberlake songs. On the way back, they heard one of them yell, "Tickle fight!" That night, a heavy storm rolled through. When we woke up the next morning, their tent was completely gone. It was strange because we typically woke up around sunrise, and they had already disappeared. Just as we were getting ready to leave, I noticed a piece of paper folded up on a stump near our tent. Curious, I picked it up and read the note. It said, "We got rained on and peed our pants. We will miss all of you. The amazing friendships we had. Red heart. The weird guys who get no respect." I don't know what was more unsettling. The fact that they shared all those random details with us for no reason, or that they were related to that creepy puppet guy. In July of 2019, I moved in with my aunt and uncle in a tiny, remote town in Oregon. When I first arrived, a friend of mine made a point to show me that you could drive across the entire town in just 5 minutes. At the time, I didn't think much of it, but later, I realized how important that fact would be for my safety and that of the people around me. My best friend, Rachel, who was 16, and I, at 17, were hanging out at a small park about a 10-minute walk from my house. I call it a park, but it was really just a few benches and tables in a clearing, surrounded by trees, with a dirt trail that ran near the edge of a creek. After moving to town, I often visited this place to sit on the benches, smoke, or relax by the water. I had never encountered anyone suspicious there, though I had heard rumors about a couple of men in the area who were known for harassing young women. Rachel and I had been sitting there for a while, unbothered, when we decided to finish our outing by walking along the trail and enjoying the scenery. We had only been walking for a few minutes when I suddenly felt a strange tension in my shoulders, the feeling you get when someone is watching you. I glanced back and noticed a man on the trail behind us. To be fair, the path ran right alongside the outer fence of a private neighborhood, so it wasn't unusual to see people jogging or walking. I pointed him out to Rachel, but she dismissed it, saying I was just overthinking things. She had a point. I did tend to be on high alert, but something about this man put me on edge. As we kept walking, I periodically looked back to keep an eye on him. He was a middle-aged man with dark hair, staying about 50 feet behind us. At first, he just walked at a normal pace, but then he started moving faster. His casual stroll turned into a speed walk. I turned completely around and walked backward for a moment, hoping to make it clear that I was aware of him. He veered off slightly, acting as if he was going to head down toward the creek, and I felt silly for overreacting. But just as I turned back around, I looked once more. He had suddenly broken into a full sprint straight toward us. Panic surged through me. I grabbed Rachel's sleeve with one hand and pulled a small pocket knife from my pocket with the other. I can't remember exactly what I shouted, but we both took off running. I had never been far down this trail before and had no idea where it led, but the man was blocking the way back to the clearing and the road. We could hear his footsteps pounding against the dirt, getting closer. I let go of Rachel's sleeve just long enough to pull out my phone and call my uncle. Gasping for breath, I told him we were being chased on the trail behind the park, but I couldn't give him an exact location because I had never gone this far before. My uncle told me to stay on the line and scream as loudly as I could so he could track us down. I let out the loudest, shrillest scream possible and kept running. The trail eventually ended at a rusty old fence surrounding what looked like an abandoned shed, and we found ourselves at the back corner of the private neighborhood's outer wall. In that split second, we knew our best bet was to climb. I shoved Rachel upward, using a tree and the ledge to help her clear the top of the cement wall. Then, I threw my phone and knife over before scrambling up after her. We landed hard on the other side, face first onto a neatly trimmed lawn. A startled man, who had been outside walking his dog, turned toward us in shock. It must have looked bizarre. Two frantic teenagers, one holding a knife, gasping for breath. But he seemed to understand that we were in trouble. He rushed over, asking if we were okay and if we needed help. Rachel started explaining what had happened while I got back on the phone with my uncle and told him we had made it over the wall into the private neighborhood. Less than a minute later, my uncle reached the trail, shouting that he was armed and issuing loud threats to whoever had chased us. The man with the dog led us to a small access gate in the fence and unlocked it so we could meet my uncle on the other side. He had driven as close as he could to the trail entrance and sprinted toward us with his gun drawn, ready for anything. However, by the time he arrived, the man who had chased us was nowhere to be seen. After checking that we were okay and hearing the full story, my uncle walked us back to his car, keeping his weapon in full view in case the man reappeared. But we never saw him again. I never returned to that trail after that day. For the rest of my time in that town, I was constantly on edge whenever I left the house, always looking over my shoulder. We never found out who that man was, and to this day, I still wonder what would have happened if we hadn't run. About 9 months ago, my partner and I had just gotten a new 6-month-old boxer pup to keep our 3-year-old Labrador company. We decided to take them both for a walk in the countryside. We live near a big city called Harford in the northeast of England and thought it would be nice to go for a walk in a rural area north of the River Helmsley, which leads out to the sea. When we arrived at a small village near an old World War II military fort, we chose to explore the nearby wooded trails and nature reserve. As we strolled along a grassy embankment toward the trees, my partner suddenly pointed out 2 young men climbing up the bank from the woods. They were moving diagonally as if they were trying to cut across our path. At first, I assumed they might be part of some World War II reenactment, since they were wearing camouflage trousers and were covered in dirt and dust. I didn't think much of them at first, figuring they would simply pass us by. However, as they got closer, it became clear that they were deliberately approaching us. When they stopped about 10 feet away, one of them spoke. The way he talked still unsettles me. His tone lacked any politeness, almost as if he wasn't used to normal conversation. He asked where we were headed, and we told him we weren't sure, just wandering to see where the path took us. He seemed disappointed by that answer and suggested we follow a specific route through the forest, insisting it led to a nice scenic spot with benches to sit on. While he talked, his friend barely said a word, but I noticed he was watching our dogs closely, as if making sure he never lost sight of them. Since we weren't familiar with the area and hadn't seen any other dog walkers, we decided to take their suggestion. They pointed to a narrow trail leading into the woods, so we headed in that direction. The trees blocked out about 30% of the sunlight, and when I glanced back, I noticed the two young men hadn't walked away. Instead, they were watching us disappear into the trees. The trail seemed unnatural, too perfectly cleared, as if someone had deliberately made it the only walkable path in the forest. About 2 minutes into the walk, our Labrador started sniffing near a bush, which wasn't unusual since both dogs sniff everything in sight. However, she kept fixating on one particular spot, rolling on the ground as if trying to cover herself in the scent. Curious, we walked over and saw what had caught her attention: a torn rubber pig mask covered in a dried brownish-red substance. It looked filthy, and my partner immediately pulled her away. Flies were swarming around it, making the whole scene feel even more disturbing. As we continued down the path, the trail became tighter, bordered by thick trees and dense bushes. Up ahead, we spotted a bend in the path and agreed that if it led to a dead end, we'd turn back. I walked slightly ahead, pulling out my phone to take a picture of the eerie-looking trees. Just then, I felt sharp pricks on my neck, chin, and parts of my face. I gasped in shock, causing my partner to stop abruptly. He quickly told me to stay still in a worried voice before carefully pulling away thin strands of string from my skin. That's when we realized what had happened. Someone had tied fishing lines with hooks between the trees, stretched right across the path. At that moment, we both felt a mix of fear, confusion, and anger. Not wanting to stick around any longer, we rushed back to the car and drove straight home. I don't want to sound overly dramatic, but as we drove away, I swear I saw something in the rearview mirror, a shadowy figure peeking out onto the road from the trees. A couple of years ago, I went on a hiking trip in the Blue Ridge Mountains. It was meant to be a simple day hike with two friends. Late in the afternoon, one of my friends started feeling sick and decided to turn back. The other friend went with him in case things got worse. They told me to continue since I had been looking forward to the hike for weeks. As evening neared, I stumbled upon a small clearing in the woods. In the middle of it stood a work table covered in tools and several cans of spray paint. Atop the table sat an intricate dollhouse about 3 feet tall. Its walls and windows were open as if it had just been built, and the strong scent of fresh paint lingered in the air. Attached to the back of the house was an old photograph. It showed a family, likely from the early 80s, judging by their clothes. No one in the picture looked frightened, but they all seemed uneasy, as if they hadn't wanted to be there. I left the clearing and pressed on, wanting to reach my campsite before nightfall. The wind had picked up, rustling the trees, and in the distance, I heard a branch snap and crash to the ground. Startled me, but I kept moving. When I finally arrived at my campsite, I couldn't shake the eerie feeling from finding that dollhouse in the middle of nowhere. I suddenly didn't like the idea of camping out in the open, especially if whoever had been working on it happened to return. I had a small one-person tent, just big enough to lie down in. I set it up behind a thick patch of brush, with one side tucked against a cluster of large rocks. I was relieved to have the extra cover, not just for concealment, but also because the rocks shielded me from the freezing wind rolling down from the mountains. That night, the wind howled through the trees, a strangely soothing sound. I must have fallen asleep quickly, but at some point, I woke up, startled by a noise. I couldn't remember exactly what it was, but a faint echo of it still lingered in my mind. I had the unsettling feeling that someone was nearby, Holding my breath, I listened hard, trying to hear past the wind. Then, in the distance, I picked up the sound of a man's voice, harsh and hurried, muttering angrily. His words were impossible to make out, but the tone reminded me of someone scolding themselves. Then his voice softened, as if responding. I remained completely still, heart pounding. His voice kept getting louder, and soon, I could hear his footsteps crunching through the underbrush, heading straight toward me. He walked by, just a few feet from where I was hidden behind the brush. The moonlight was faint, but my eyes had adjusted enough to make out a hulking figure. He had to be at least 6 feet 5 inches and broad-shouldered. He carried something long under one arm, a rolled-up tent. Maybe, as he stomped past, still talking to himself, his words shifted from ranting about a face that wouldn't leave him alone to something bizarre about cheese and crackers. It was clear he was completely unhinged. After a while, his voice faded into the distance. I barely slept the rest of the night. As soon as the first light broke over the trees, I packed up and got the hell out of there. On my way back, I passed by the clearing again. The table was still there. The tools were still there. But the dollhouse? It was gone. For those who aren't familiar, this is a well-known trail, and a whole community has formed around it. At popular camping spots, you can find food and drinks, and many hikers meet and bond along the way. In fact, a friend of mine met his wife while hiking this trail alone. Because of this strong sense of community, my friend felt confident that she would be safe on her journey. For the first 3 or 4 nights, she camped with different groups of hikers she met on the trail, and everything was great. They shared stories, toasted marshmallows, and enjoyed a few drinks. Classic camping fun. But on the first night she decided to camp alone, things felt off. She felt a bit uneasy, but brushed it off as nerves. After all, she had been having such a great time with other hikers. She spent the next 3 nights camping solo, and each night, the uneasiness grew stronger. It soon turned into a deep feeling that something or someone was watching her. She also started noticing that some of her belongings weren't quite where she had left them in the morning. She wasn't completely sure, though, and tried to dismiss it. Eventually, the unsettling feeling became so intense that she made a point to camp near other hikers for the next couple of nights. She felt silly about it, but the company reassured her. Then, one night, she decided to camp alone again. She couldn't explain why, but the moment she settled in, the feeling returned, worse than before. It was so overwhelming that she abandoned her plan to finish the hike solo. At the next town, she made up an excuse about twisting her ankle and went home, feeling foolish for quitting because of a gut feeling. A couple of weeks later, feeling nostalgic, she went through the photos from her trip on her digital camera, something she hadn't done since returning home. At first, she saw the pictures she had taken of landscapes and the hikers she met in the early days. Then, suddenly, she came across a photo of herself, asleep in her sleeping bag inside her tent. That was strange. Maybe someone she had met had grabbed her camera and taken it as a joke? There was nothing in the image that gave away the exact night or campsite. But then there were more photos, more pictures of her sleeping in her tent. And this time, she recognized the campsite. It was one where she had camped alone. As she kept flipping through, she found more and more of these pictures. Every time she had camped alone, there was a photo of her, fast asleep. Needless to say, she has no plans to hike solo again. It was the winter of 2016, and I was employed at a medical clinic in Eureka Springs, Arkansas. I had just gotten a brand new smartphone and was excited to test out the time-lapse feature on its camera. On my way home from work one late afternoon, I decided to stop and capture the sunset over Beaver Lake. It was a breathtaking evening, with the winter sun about to dip below the horizon. I pulled into a small parking lot near a state park entrance, noticing that mine was the only vehicle there. It didn't concern me. I stepped out and immediately felt the harsh cold. Though the sun was shining, the wind was piercing. I opened the back of my car, put on a pair of gloves, and swapped my shoes for sturdier ones before heading down a narrow path that led to the water's edge. As I walked, I noticed the paddleboat cruise making its slow journey across the lake on its evening tour. I thought it would make an interesting addition to my time-lapse video. I was 30 years old at the time, used to taking risks alone without much worry. The path to the shore was lined with large stones, marking the trail's edges. In my eagerness to set up my camera, I lost my balance and tumbled forward, landing hard. My head nearly hit a sharp rock. If I hadn't managed to stop myself just in time, I might have been knocked out. Pain shot through my knee and hand. As I sat there, recovering, I realized how reckless I had been. No one knew where I was, and I had almost seriously hurt myself in freezing temperatures just as night was setting in. Still, since I was already on the ground, I decided to film from where I had fallen. But I was about to discover that my fall was the least of my worries. Got a light. I nearly jumped out of my skin. Spinning around, I saw him, standing about 20 feet behind me. "Sorry," I said quickly. "I don't smoke. I saw you get out of your car up there," he said. Then, grinning, he added, "You've got a really nice ass." Where had he come from? When I arrived, there hadn't been another soul around. What happened next might sound unbelievable, but I assure you, it's true. Within less than a minute of appearing, he said, "Hey, wanna hook up?" A sickening realization hit me. I was in serious danger. If I screamed, no one would hear. Sure, the paddleboat was out on the lake, but it was far away, and the people on board wouldn't notice me, let alone hear me over the noise of the boat. Without hesitating, I forced a smile and played along. "It's too cold for that out here," I said. "Let's go to my car instead." I had to get off that trail before it got dark. The sunset no longer mattered. As we walked up the path together, I don't remember everything he said, but at one point, he asked if he could touch me. I agreed. I knew it was a test. If I resisted, he might change his mind about letting me leave the trail. My only goal was to make it back to the parking lot alive. God, how had I let myself get into this situation? I was so stupid. I begged silently, "Just let me get out of this, and I swear I'll be smarter next time." He kept one hand down the back of my pants for the rest of the walk. My stomach turned, but I kept up the act, knowing it was my best chance of survival. When we reached the parking lot, my heart sank. My car was still the only one there, except for a vehicle that hadn't been parked there earlier. I knew it had to be his. He must have been watching me before he approached, and at some point, he had moved his car to block the trail entrance. You might wonder why I didn't call 911 while walking. The answer is simple: he was watching my every move. I couldn't risk setting him off. I had already convinced him to leave the trail because of the cold. My next mission was to get inside my car and escape. Standing next to his vehicle, he continued making crude comments about what he wanted to do to me. I pretended to be interested, asking for his name and number. He refused to give me either. Why wouldn't he tell me his name? Then he started unzipping his pants. My heart pounded. I told him we should move toward my car first. As we walked, he grabbed something from inside his vehicle. I didn't get a good look, but I had a sinking feeling it was a gun. We reached my car. I pressed the unlock button, knowing it would only open the driver's door. My keys were already in my hand, positioned to move fast. The second he reached for the passenger door handle, I jumped inside, slammed my door shut, and locked it. He tried to yank the door open, but I threw the car into reverse, my tires spinning against the loose gravel. Then I shifted to drive and floored it, speeding away without looking back. Shaking, I grabbed my phone and dialed 911. I described him as best I could. About 6 feet tall, blonde hair, brown eyes, somewhat muscular build, around 26 to 30 years old. He was actually good looking, which somehow made it all even more unsettling. I didn't get his license plate number, but I described his car, an old, light blue sedan, probably from the early 90s. It reminded me of my great-uncle's old Buick. After taking my statement, the authorities never followed up with me again. I'll never know what else he may have done to others, but one thing I do know for sure: I had come face to face with pure evil. In July of 2019, I moved in with my aunt and uncle in a tiny, remote town in Oregon. When I first arrived, a friend of mine made a point to show me that you could drive across the entire town in just 5 minutes. At the time, I didn't think much of it, but later, I realized how important that fact would be for my safety and that of the people around me. My best friend, Rachel, who was 16, and I, at 17, were hanging out at a small park about a 10-minute walk from my house. I call it a park, but it was really just a few benches and tables in a clearing, surrounded by trees, with a dirt trail that ran near the edge of a creek. After moving to town, I often visited this place to sit on the benches, smoke, or relax by the water. I had never encountered anyone suspicious there, though I had heard rumors about a couple of men in the area who were known for harassing young women. Rachel and I had been sitting there for a while, unbothered, when we decided to finish our outing by walking along the trail and enjoying the scenery. We had only been walking for a few minutes when I suddenly felt a strange tension in my shoulders, the feeling you get when someone is watching you. I glanced back and noticed a man on the trail behind us. To be fair, the path ran right alongside the outer fence of a private neighborhood, so it wasn't unusual to see people jogging or walking. I pointed him out to Rachel, but she dismissed it, saying I was just overthinking things. She had a point. I did tend to be on high alert, but something about this man put me on edge. As we kept walking, I periodically looked back to keep an eye on him. He was a middle-aged man with dark hair, staying about 50 feet behind us. At first, he just walked at a normal pace, but then he started moving faster. His casual stroll turned into a speed walk. I turned completely around and walked backward for a moment, hoping to make it clear that I was aware of him. He veered off slightly, acting as if he was going to head down toward the creek, and I felt silly for overreacting. But just as I turned back around, I looked once more. He had suddenly broken into a full sprint straight toward us. Panic surged through me. I grabbed Rachel's sleeve with one hand and pulled a small pocket knife from my pocket with the other. I can't remember exactly what I shouted, but we both took off running. I had never been far down this trail before and had no idea where it led, but the man was blocking the way back to the clearing and the road. We could hear his footsteps pounding against the dirt, getting closer. I let go of Rachel's sleeve just long enough to pull out my phone and call my uncle. Gasping for breath, I told him we were being chased on the trail behind the park, but I couldn't give him an exact location because I had never gone this far before. My uncle told me to stay on the line and scream as loudly as I could so he could track us down. I let out the loudest, shrillest scream possible and kept running. The trail eventually ended at a rusty old fence surrounding what looked like an abandoned shed, and we found ourselves at the back corner of the private neighborhood's outer wall. In that split second, we knew our best bet was to climb. I shoved Rachel upward, using a tree and the ledge to help her clear the top of the cement wall. Then, I threw my phone and knife over before scrambling up after her. We landed hard on the other side, face first onto a neatly trimmed lawn. A startled man, who had been outside walking his dog, turned toward us in shock. It must have looked bizarre. Two frantic teenagers, one holding a knife, gasping for breath. But he seemed to understand that we were in trouble. He rushed over, asking if we were okay and if we needed help. Rachel started explaining what had happened while I got back on the phone with my uncle and told him we had made it over the wall into the private neighborhood. Less than a minute later, my uncle reached the trail, shouting that he was armed and issuing loud threats to whoever had chased us. The man with the dog led us to a small access gate in the fence and unlocked it so we could meet my uncle on the other side. He had driven as close as he could to the trail entrance and sprinted toward us with his gun drawn, ready for anything. However, by the time he arrived, the man who had chased us was nowhere to be seen. After checking that we were okay and hearing the full story, my uncle walked us back to his car, keeping his weapon in full view in case the man reappeared. But we never saw him again. I never returned to that trail after that day. For the rest of my time in that town, I was constantly on edge whenever I left the house, always looking over my shoulder. We never found out who that man was, and to this day, I still wonder what would have happened if we hadn't run. A few weeks back, my girlfriend Sarah and I decided to go on a random hike while exploring the Santa Monica area. Originally, we planned to visit a different trail, but traffic made it too far, so we settled on a closer one we found through an online review site. After locating the trailhead, we started our hike towards what was supposed to be a 3-tier waterfall, though due to a drought, it was practically dry. Midway through the hike, we passed 3 guys, 2 of them shirtless and covered in dirt, who greeted us. Sarah joked that they looked sketchy and might be up to something. Taking her comment half seriously, I handed her my spare pocket knife, which I always carry for safety. Once we reached the falls, we turned back. As we made our way down, we suddenly heard leaves rustling and heavy footsteps in the ravine beside the trail. We stopped and turned toward the noise. I guessed that a tree might be falling, considering several had exposed roots, making them more likely to topple. Sarah, however, whispered, "Jake, that doesn't sound like a tree falling." Shoo! The sound, loud swishing and stomping, grew closer. Whatever it was seemed to be moving up toward us. When I saw some tall plants shaking as if something large had just pushed through them, I shouted, "Sarah, run!" We both bolted down the trail while the thing pursued us through the ravine. At one point, it sounded like it was trying to cut us off from the only exit. While running, I realized Sarah should be ahead of me since she was faster. I grabbed her arm, yanked her forward, and told her to keep going. As we fled, I made the classic horror movie mistake. I looked back. Bad idea. I saw a bush taller than me. I'm 5 feet 6 inches, shaking violently. I turned back around and ran faster, but I didn't notice a dip in the ground and twisted my recently healed ankle. It slowed me down. Sarah hesitated, but I told her to keep running. Eventually, she stopped, and we both caught our breath, drinking water and trying to piece together what had just happened. We walked the rest of the trail cautiously, keeping our knives ready. I reassured Sarah that if anything happened, she should keep running while I stayed behind, since I had some martial arts training and could put up a better fight. Joking to lighten the mood, I told her, "This is exactly why sprinter jeans come in handy." Just then, the swishing noise returned. Without hesitation, Sarah sprinted off, and we both ran for our lives once again. This part still makes me laugh. While running, we spotted 2 hikers ahead. Sarah had already put away her knife, but I, trailing behind, was still holding my small pocket knife, yelling at her to stop. Realizing how ridiculous I must have looked, I quickly tried to hide the knife so I wouldn't seem like a lunatic chasing her. We walked the final stretch, feeling safer as we encountered more people and dogs heading toward the falls. Once we exited the trail and reached the road, we took a moment to catch our breath and discuss what had just happened. Sarah suspected one of the guys we saw earlier might have been messing with us, hiding in the ravine to scare us. To this day, we don't know what it was, but the closest possibility we found after researching the area was a reported sighting of a mountain lion a few months back. Even so, I don't fully believe it was a mountain lion. I just told Sarah it might have been one since she gets easily spooked by these things. Whatever chased us moved too aggressively, too heavily. It was big, whatever it was.